Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the October webinar for LEA Special Education Points of Contact. My name is Annette Thacker-Bartlett, and I am joined today by Mr. Michael Craig from the Division of Data Assessment and Research from the assessment team, who will be talking about alternate eligibility. I'm also joined today by Ms. Leah Diggs-Natico and Ms. Rita Larkins from the Division of Data Assessment and Research, who will be talking to us today about child count and a few SEDS items. Today's webinar will be recorded and posted within 48 hours after this broadcast. As we're going along, please feel free to type your questions in the question chat box. As we go along, we will do our best to answer your questions, and we will stay on the line for a few minutes following the broadcast to continue to answer your questions, or we can follow up with you later by email. Today we're going to start off with updates and reminders for child count. Then we're going to talk about the alternate assessment eligibility process for this school year, including the timeline for when you should have your roster of students identified who will be eligible for the alternate assessment and the review process that OSSE will go through. And then we're going to show to you a new feature in SEDS that has to do with the alternate assessment eligibility form. All right. So we're going to start off today with the child count updates and reminders. Then we're going to talk about the alternate assessment eligibility process for this school year, including how OSSE will review the students that you say on their IEPs are eligible and with their criteria form. Then we're going to show you how the alternate assessment eligibility criteria form has now been built into SEDS and what that looks like. And then we will end the webinar by announcing several professional development opportunities that we would like for you to pass on to your staff as relevant. I am going to turn the time over to Ms. Leah to talk about child count.
Thank you, Annette. So just to get started, I want to go over the child count timeline. So we've had the first certification. So now LEAs are to access, review, and resolve all child count data anomalies by November 17th. Please note also that November 17th is the last day to make any SPED corrections so that you'll be able to see them by November 18th. Again, November 17th is the last day to make any changes, with hopes that you'll be able to see them by November 18th. Also, please go to click to review your SPED errors. So November 20th, the LEAs are going to sign the data certification form, and December 15th, the LEA is going to sign the final enrollment audit and child count acknowledgement form. Just a brief overview, child count is a federally mandated activity. It's reported annually and serves as the official special education enrollment numbers for the District of Columbia. In accordance with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, also known as IDEA, and all applicable DC laws and regulations, each local education agency is required to certify the accuracy and reliability of its data to OSSE, which is also the state education agency. Just to make sure that everyone is aware that the accuracy of special education data impacts funding for special education. And all of the data to be reviewed for child count comes through our source system, which is a special education data system. If any of the students' special education information is inaccurate, the data must be corrected in the source system, which is SEDS. So just so that everyone is aware, students must be enrolled by October 5th. They must have a current IEP and current eligibility. IEP amendments must be completed by 5 p.m. on November 17th. This table here shows you what needs to occur in order for a student to show up on child count roster. So The IEP has to be current, eligibility is current, students receiving services under IDEA, the student will be included in child count. If the IEP is expired, but the student has a current eligibility and the student is receiving services under IDEA, the student will be included in child count. If the student has a current IEP, an expired eligibility, is receiving services under IDEA, the student will be included in the child count roster. If the student has a current IEP, no eligibility, receiving services under IDEA, the student will be included in child count. Now, if the student has an expired IEP and an expired eligibility, if the student is not receiving services under IDEA, the student will not be included in child count. And lastly, if the student does not have an IEP at all or the IEP is not finalized, but they do have a current eligibility, the student is not receiving services under IDEA, the student will not be included in child count. So OSSE has made some changes to the child count. The process is more streamlined. Again, you must review and update the data in the respective source system. We are not having an appeals process for child count. The data will be certified through the enrollment audit and child count application. Therefore, we are not holding an appeals process as we have in the past. And we are also including additional certification timelines. In all cases where there is an identified data discrepancy, LEAs must resolve the errors in a manner that complies with all IDEA procedural requirements. So the next few slides, we're just going to talk about some common issues and errors that we find when we are when we receive OST tickets, which is also known as the OSSE support tool. When some users have submitted tickets, we've just gone through and we've put up the most common ones and given you some suggested resolutions. So the first one is a student has an expired IEP with an active eligibility. So this would be a SPED error that you would see. The suggested resolution would be to hold an IEP meeting and update the finalized IEP in SEDS. And these errors come from the Unified Data Errors application. So the next error that you may see is the student is active in SEDS but withdrawn from the SIS, which is the Student Information System. The suggested resolution would be the LEA should ensure that the appropriate exit code was used. If the appropriate code was used, the LEA should follow the process in SEDS to have the student administratively exit from the LEA roster. The next one is educational environment age. The suggested resolution would be the LEA should review the student's date of birth to ensure that the age is accurate. If the age is not accurate, then you should enter the student's date of birth in your SIS. If the age displayed is accurate in the enrollment audit child count application, then the LEA will need to select an age-appropriate educational environment in SEDS by completing an IEP amendment. What you might also notice with this particular error is that the student may end up with a demographic conflict. So also be mindful of demographic conflicts when you're dealing with students' date of birth. The next one is student turned age 6. So OSSE has taken into account that students who turn age 6 very close to the enrollment audit period. So if a student is turning age 6 5 days prior to November 17th certification, those students are going to be excluded from the errors pool based upon the student's date of birth. The next SPED error that we've seen pretty common is specialized instruction and or missing services. So again, you're going to have to review the current finalized IEP and confirm the hours are accurately reflected. If any corrections are needed to be made, please complete and finalize the IEP amendment or hold an annual IEP meeting to review and update the student's eligibility or service hours. The next is developmental delay. If you have a student that's reached age 8 The LEA should conduct a reevaluation to determine the appropriate category and finalize the IEP. If the student's date of birth is inaccurate, you should correct this in the student information system. So here are just some tips. So in SEDS, when you're searching for students with disabilities and you filter by special ed, you will not receive results from students who have expired IEPs or from students whose records have not fully transferred. If the special education level is incorrect, confirm the service start and end dates are correct. We receive a lot of OST tickets regarding this. So again, please, on the IEP, check that the service start and end dates are correct. Also confirm least restrictive environment percentage and that the check boxes are marked appropriately. The educational environment will be pulled from the most recent IEP in SEDS and displayed in SLED. If the education environment is not accurate, it may be appropriate to complete an IEP amendment to make this correction. So here we have some summary of actions. So if the student has demographic errors or conflicts, such as the name, date of birth, race, ethnicity, you should review the information in SEDS. If it's accurate, then you do not need to take any action. If it's not accurate, please update this information in your student information system. And we've provided some examples of what your student information systems may be. So we have eSchool Plus, PowerSchool, Aspen, SchoolForce, Proactive. If there is an error regarding special education, such as the disability, the IEP date, educational environment, dedicated aid, we've provided some actions that you may take in order to resolve these errors as well on this slide. So again, please make sure that all students are enrolled as of October 5th. Ensure all demographic and special education information is accurate for all students. Ensure the education environment indicated is accurate. Review and resolve all data anomalies no later than November 17th to be considered timely, and again at 5 o'clock. That's the cutoff. So in order to review the anomalies, you would do so in the Unified Data Errors Click app. There is a special education sheet that is dedicated for special education errors. The suggested resolution paths are also provided in that Click application. All special education point of contacts have access to the Unified Data Errors Click app. If you need access, please submit a ticket in the OSSE support tool. Here, this slide just shows some of the data systems that will impact child count. So we have the LEA membership tracker, and this is for resolving demographic conflicts, such as the student's first name, last name, date of birth, race, gender, and ethnicity. In the Click Unified Data Errors application, this is where you're going to find the special education errors that will impact child count. And again, we provide the suggested resolution path for you to have those errors resolved. In SEDS, which is the source system, if the student has errors related to eligibility, IEP, services, or education environment, these errors must be completed in SEDS. All IEP amendments must be completed and finalized in SEDS prior to November 17th. Each LEA has an OSSE LEA liaison. And these liaisons can assist with matters related to start of school, enrollment audit, child count, and other OSSE data collection activities throughout the year. If you have any questions, please type so in the question box, and we will be able to respond to them during this presentation.
Do we want to answer any of these questions?
We're going to pause one moment to look at questions in the chat box before we move to the next section. Thank you.
Okay, so we are going to go ahead and respond to some of the questions that we've received in the question box. So one question that we received is, it says, in regular early childhood program, at least 10 hours per week, and most special education services provided outside general education setting. The student with this error is in first grade. The user does not understand how to correct this in SEDS. So please note that for education environment, you have to select the radio buttons. It will show you what you have for the previous IEP, not the current one. So that's going to be a manual action that you're going to have to take, and that's in the least restrictive environment module within the IEP process. We receive a lot of questions on that, so that's a manual process that you guys have to do. Hold on one moment, we'll take another question.
While you're talking.
Okay. So,
So here we're just going to showcase for just a minute that place in SEDS where in the IEP process, where we often see a lot of errors for child count because people assume that in the IEP process, certain things will default to the right level. So I'm just going to point that out to you. Here we have the IEP process. So please train your staff that when they are doing the IEP process for a student and they go to the least restrictive environment page, here you will see in the LRE, this first line, the LRE, it gives a percentage. So here it says B, 21 to 60% outside of the general education classroom. And then the percentage, 34.5%. This percentage is automatically calculated from the previous page where you assigned services, specialized instruction and related services in or out of the classroom. So this percentage is correct based on what you input previously. However, look down here at the radio buttons. You'll notice that radio button A is automatically default. It has not selected B. You will need to manually select B to make sure that that's correct. And I think a lot of people don't realize. Oh, we can't see my screen?
Mm-mm.
Oh, my screen. Okay, let's see. We might have frozen the screen. Show screen. My screen. Okay, let's start that over. My screen was frozen on the slide. Okay, so I am in SEDS in the IEP process, and I am going here on the services and supplemental aids page is where you assign those related services and specialized instruction either in or outside of the classroom, and then SEDS is able to calculate a percent that you're in or out of the classroom. And you'll see here that my LRE percentage is 34.55% based on what this student has for their previous, on the previous page assigned for their services. That puts the student in category B, 21 to 60% outside general education classroom. But look at these radio buttons. These radio buttons do not automatically jump to the correct one. You have to manually select B as the correct environment category here within the IEP process. Whoever did your student's IEP, if they failed to manually select the right button and save that during the process of the IEP, then you're going to have an error, because now once the IEP is finalized, it will show category A for their environment, but it will be a mismatch with the services they're getting, and it really should be B. So if this button was not chosen correctly during the IEP process, this is an IEP amendment that needs to happen by November 17th, hopefully much sooner than that, to fix this error. And again, you don't have to have a meeting to do an IEP process. You can do the documented written agreement method, where you're just filling out the paperwork and explaining to the parent or guardian the error that needs to be corrected. So again, please train your staff when they're doing the IEP process to always remember to manually select the correct LRE category using these radio buttons as part of the IEP process, so that you do not have to go back and fix this as an error later for purposes of child count. And as Rita mentioned, you want to make sure during the IEP process that you note that the IEP is a speech-only IEP. See this box right here? Let me show you again how I got to this. If it's a speech-only box during the IEP process on the Services and Supplemental Aids page, you need to check the box for speech-only IEP, and that should resolve the error for those situations. I'm going to turn it back over to Leah for any further questions. So we are getting a number of other questions that are very specific about certain situations. And so what we need to do at this time is submit a ticket in the OSSE support tool, and that ticket will be routed to your DAR liaison. And again, so those are for any specific questions you have about students related to child count. Please put a ticket in the OSSE support tool, and it will be routed to your DAR liaison. Thank you so much for putting your questions in. This is very helpful to us to have that feedback. I'm now going to turn the time over to Michael Craig, who's going to talk about the alternate assessment eligibility timeline for this school year.
All right, thank you, Annette. Good morning, everyone. So for the 2017-18 school year, the following alternate assessments will be available in the District of Columbia. The MSAA, which is the multi-state alternative assessment in the areas of ELA and mathematics. The Access for ELLs alternate assessment, and the DC Science alternate assessment. MSAA will be administered to students in grades 3 through 8 and 11. The alternate access assessment for ELLs will be administered for students in grades 1 through 12. And the DC Science alternate assessment will be administered to students in grades 5, 8, and high school biology. So, in order to participate in the MSAA, it will be administered again to students in grades 3 through 8 and 11, and the students must meet the following criteria. The student has a significant cognitive disability. The student is learning content linked, derived from the Common Core state standards, and the student requires extensive, direct, individualized instruction and substantial supports to achieve measurable gains in the grade and age appropriate curriculum. So criteria 1, the student has a significant cognitive disability. In order to meet this criteria, a review of the student records indicates a disability or multiple disabilities that significantly impact intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior. Some data sources used to identify this criteria can be individualized cognitive ability tests, results from informal assessments, and results of individual reading assessments, along with other data sources. The term most significant cognitive disability is defined as significant limitations in 2 or more adaptive skill areas, such as daily living, communication, self-care, social skills, academic skills, and work skills. It is also a condition that has been presented from early childhood and can include, but not limited to, the following categories: disability categories such as intellectual disabilities, multiple disabilities, and autism spectrum disorder. Disabilities that do not meet the criteria are learning disabilities, speech language impairment, and emotional behavioral disabilities. Criteria 2. The student is learning content linked to and derived from the Common Core state standards. So goals and instruction are listed in the IEP for the student, are linked to an enrolled grade level Common Core, and address knowledge and skills that are appropriate and challenging for the student. This student is learning content that is linked to and derived from standards that are appropriately broken into smaller steps called Common Core connectors. So some data sources that can be used to determine this criteria are progress monitoring data sources, data from scientific research-based interventions, and present levels of performance and goals in the student's IEP. Criterion 3, the student requires extensive, direct, individualized instruction and substantial supports to achieve measurable gains in the grade and age-appropriate curriculum. Further analysis of this criteria shows that the student requires extensive, repeated, individualized instruction and support that is not of a temporary or transient nature. The student also uses substantial adaptive materials and individualized methods of accessing information in alternative ways to acquire, maintain, generalize, demonstrate, and transfer skills across academic content. And some data sources that can be used to meet this criteria are teacher-collected data and checklists, and present levels of academic performance and goals and objectives listed in the student's IEP. So at this time, we're going to discuss and review examples of student profiles. Remember that these profiles are just an example. All of our students with significant cognitive disabilities differ, but these are some examples that we may come across. Prior to the examples, we have listed the 5 denial codes for alternate assessment eligibility. These denial codes are reasons that a student may not be granted permission to participate in an alternate assessment by OSSE. So in 1, the student record does not indicate a disability or multiple disabilities that significantly impact intellectual function and adaptive behavior. In 2, individualized educational program goals and instruction are not linked to enrolled grade level Common Core state standards and do not address knowledge and skills that are appropriate and challenging for the student. In 3, the student does not require extensive, repeated, individualized instruction and support, nor uses substantial adaptive materials and individualized methods of accessing information in alternative ways to acquire, maintain, generalize, demonstrate, and transfer skills across academic content. In 4, alternate assessment is not assigned in the special education data system. And in 5, the IEP is not current in SEDS. So as you can see, 3 out of the 5 denial codes are highlighted in blue. These are the most common denial codes we have received in previous school years. These 3 denial codes are easy fixes, and they are administrative denial codes that the IEP team needs to ensure are in place prior to applying for alternate assessment eligibility participation. If you also notice, for those of you that participated in this process last year, we have reduced the number of denial codes to 5. In previous years, there were 8 denial codes. This year, we have reduced them to 5. So our first case profile. Jason is 13 years old and uses an assistive technology device with voice and print output to take part in classroom discussions and activities, as well as to participate in assessments. Jason's instruction takes place outside of the general education classroom in a full-time specialized instruction setting with 5 peers. Goals and objectives listed in the IEP are linked to Common Core state standards, and instruction is derived from Common Core connectors. For Jason to access the curriculum, content is scaffolded at the intense level of support based on the Universal Design for Learning framework. Jason's primary disability classification is multiple disabilities. So based on the information that we received about Jason, Jason would apply for alternate assessment participation. Goals and objectives are linked to Common Core connectors as well as Common Core state standards. And Jason's primary disability classification is multiple disabilities. There are other factors we would take into consideration, but this is just an example of a student that would be eligible for alternate assessment participation. Case profile 2. Randy is 17 years old and receives instruction in an inclusion setting for all his classes with assistance from a paraprofessional. Randy demonstrates difficulty with retention. However, he is able to access the general education curriculum with proper accommodations and modifications to assignments. Results from recent psychological testing indicate an overall IQ score of 69. Randy receives specialized instruction services under the disability classification of intellectual disability. So, after reviewing Randy's profile, although he has an intellectual disability of a disability classification of intellectual disability, Randy would not receive eligibility for alternate assessment participation because he is able to access the curriculum in the general education setting, and he receives accommodations and modifications to his assignments in the general education setting. So therefore, he would not be eligible for alternate assessment participation. So those were just 2 examples of students that we may encounter. Again, all student scenarios are different, and OSSE does take into consideration individualized student profiles, but we just wanted to provide you with an example of a case or 2. Okay, so we had a question from a participant regarding the disability classifications that do not qualify for alternate assessment eligibility participation. So the disabilities that do not meet the criteria for a significant cognitive disability are learning disabilities, speech language impairment, and emotional behavior disabilities.
So when it comes to determining whether or not a student is eligible to take the alternate assessment, the criteria is all about identifying whether or not they have a significant cognitive disability. If a student is classified as having a specific learning disability, by definition of that disability, that does not rise to the level of a significant cognitive disability. What we're looking at here is more of a severe intellectual disability or other impairment that affects you more significantly with regards to the type of instruction and modifications. If a student has a specific learning disability as their disability category, then they either do not have a significant cognitive disability to the level of qualifying for alternate assessment, or you may need to, or if you feel like they do have that significant cognitive disability with their intellectual functioning, then you might want to consider a reevaluation to see if they are classified in the incorrect disability category. And again, this is very specific, student by student. The criteria is not, it's not black and white. For example, even if you have an intellectual disability as a student, that still does not automatically qualify you to take the alternate assessment. It needs to rise to the level of being a significant cognitive disability that meets the criteria that Michael just talked about with their learning, what they're learning, and that they require this extensive, direct, individualized instruction and substantial supports. And so what you're doing by filling out this criteria form is essentially filling out an application to say, hey, our IEP team really feels that this student meets the criteria to qualify to take the alternate assessment, and OSSE says, okay, let's take a look. And OSSE will go through a review to go and look for evidence that the student meets this criteria, and that evidence can be found within the IEP, their present levels, the goals, the things they're working on, in their evaluation data that's most current, and other sources of data that are found in SEDS. And of course, Michael also will talk about the timeline, which if there is a dispute as to whether or not a student qualifies for this assessment, there is an appeals process by which you are able to communicate back and forth with OSSE to provide additional rationale for why you believe the student should take the assessment. Great. We also see a lot of questions that are probably very specific to be able to talk to someone at OSSE about. So Michael will definitely provide his contact information. We can put that in the chat box. Just generally speaking, it's pretty easy. It's michael.craig@dc.gov. We'll put that in the chat box. And in this next section, he's going to talk about expectations for who needs to take action in SEDS and who does not, depending on whether or not the student has already had their criteria form filled out. So we're going to turn it back over to Michael.
Okay, thank you, Annette. So for the 2017-18 school year, schools will complete the DC Alternate Assessment Participation Decisions documentation form in SEDS for all students that IEP teams have determined a need to participate in any alternate assessment. So again, if your IEP team meets and determines that a student needs to participate in an alternate assessment, please complete the DC Alternate Assessment Participation Decision Documentation Form in SEDS. Students that were alt confirmed for the 2016-17 school year will need a current PDF eligibility worksheet upload or electronic form in SEDS. So again, for those that were alt confirmed and participated in an alternate assessment for the 2016-17 school year, they will need a PDF version or an electronic version uploaded into SEDS.
And so just to clarify that even more, some of you may be wondering if you need to do an amendment to the IEP. Right now, the current final IEP, if it already says yes, they are eligible for the assessment, if that's the status on the current IEP and that status will not change, then you do not need to do an IEP amendment. You just need to make sure that that eligibility criteria worksheet is uploaded into SEDS and is there and easy to find for when the OSSE team goes to look for that eligibility worksheet to be uploaded. Again, this is if they already have yes on their IEP, they were confirmed last year, just make sure that worksheet is available and obvious of where to find it in SEDS, and then no action is needed at this time.
So for renewed alternate assessment applicants, so meaning they were alt confirmed last year and you want to renew their application for the 2017-18 school year, you need to complete the PDF DC alternate assessment participation decision documentation form in SED. So this form should actually be completed at every IEP annual review. If you have not done so, please upload the PDF form into SEDS in the document section. PDF forms will no longer be accepted for IEPs finalized after October 23rd of 2017. So if you have already finalized your IEP and you have not uploaded the PDF form for the alternate assessment, please do so as soon as possible and label it under the alternate assessment participation form. Also, ensure that the current IEP indicates alternate assessment. Make sure that it's selected on the IEP. If the IEP does not indicate alternate assessment, an IEP amendment is needed. So again, current IEP must indicate alternate assessment and it must be selected by the IEP team. If it does not indicate alternate assessment, an IEP amendment is needed. Also, upload all supporting documentations into SEDS and ensure that the IEP is current in SEDS. For new applicants, and we define new as students entering into the 3rd grade or new to the District of Columbia, you must complete the electronic DC alternate assessment participation decision documentation form in SEDS. Ensure that the IEP is current and alternate assessment is selected, and upload all supporting documentation into SEDS.
So we've had some questions come in about this. So just to clarify, if a student has transferred to you from another school and you don't know what tests they took in the previous year, you're still able to go look at their previous IEP to see the status of the alternate eligibility assessment for the previous year, or perhaps their current IEP. Let's say a student's current IEP was made current in December last year, then whatever status it had last year in December that was decided by the IEP team, that has remained all the way up until now. So it's likely if they are eligible, it already says yes on their current IEP. And then next time you do the annual IEP update, if you still feel like they are eligible for the alternate assessment, then you say yes again. But this time when you go to renew the IEP in December, now there's going to be, instead of a worksheet, the actual questions on the worksheet are now actually built into the IEP process in SEDS. And we're going to show you what that looks like in a minute. So just to add clarity so there's not any confusion, what's going to happen is that PDF, that worksheet with the criteria that Michael reviewed with you today with those questions about their learning and things like that, that criteria is not changing. What is changing is instead of downloading, filling out, and scanning, uploading back into SEDS the worksheet, instead of doing that, you will now just answer those same questions embedded in the SEDS process as you're doing your annual IEP review. And that's going to go live on October 23rd. And that's why we say we're not allowing that worksheet as a PDF upload anymore after the 23rd, because at that point you will simply just answer those same questions embedded into the IEP process in SEDS. So if you have students right now who their IEP says yes, they are eligible for the ALT, but they are missing that worksheet, you need to upload that worksheet into SEDS at this time, because as soon as October 23rd rolls around, then instead of the worksheet, you will just need to go actually fill it out in SEDS, fill out that criteria worksheet in SEDS as a questionnaire. It's no longer a worksheet document, if that makes sense. So when it comes to IEP amendments, an IEP amendment is not needed unless you're changing the actual status of a student for their participation. If their IEP right now says no, not eligible, but you believe that they are, then you need to do an IEP amendment and do that whole process. And as part of that amendment, you're going to fill out this worksheet, but now it's not a worksheet, it will now be built into SEDS as of October 23rd. If their IEP says yes, they are eligible, but the IEP team feels that that is wrong, you need to do an amendment and remove that and change it to a no for eligibility. So everything, what you just need to do is just make sure that every student you have, whatever their current IEP is as of right now, is the correct status. And if it's not, amend it to change that status. And then look at your students that have a yes for their status. Make sure that that criteria worksheet was filled out at some point and is able to be located in SEDS as a document somewhere. And if it's not there, you need to add that into SEDS as the documentation that OSSE needs to see, or you can wait till October 23rd and answer the questionnaire in the online form within that IEP process. Now, new applicants, it could be third graders. Third graders take the park for the first time. So if a student is in third grade right now, this could be the first time that somebody even had to think about whether or not they qualified for the ALT. So those are considered new applicants. So in that case, it is very important that the IEP team meets at some point, either they just barely met or some point in the near future, to think about whether or not this student is going to need to take the ALT. Because once OSSE starts reviewing the applications, we need to see that student there in the mix if you think they are eligible. So you might have to be a little proactive if you have third graders and their IEP annual update isn't going to roll around until January. You might need to consider bumping that up or doing an IEP amendment if you need to change their status to yes, if it's not already a yes, and if that worksheet's not already there. Now, in the interest of time, we're going to keep it moving so we can finish out the webinar by 11 o'clock, but continue sending in your questions, and we'll hang out for a few minutes after to keep answering those questions.
Perfect. So here is a quick overview of the timeline for the alternate assessment eligibility process. So beginning October 23rd, like Annette stated, the electronic form will be available in SEDS. That's when it will go live. So LEA's IEP teams will complete the electronic version between October 23rd and November 17th. If your IEP has been finalized prior to October 23rd, you must ensure that the PDF worksheet is uploaded into SEDS. So this will serve as your application for the alternate assessment eligibility. Again, the timeline window for applying to participate in an alternate assessment runs from October 23rd to November 17th. Afterwards, OSSE will review the applications and documentation in SEDS from November 24th to December 15th. On December 21st, OSSE will send the eligibility determination to LEAs in SEDS. From December 22nd to January 12th, LEAs may appeal eligibility determinations by submitting additional evidence to OSSE in QuickBase. This year, we are utilizing QuickBase as a secure portal to communicate from between LEAs and OSSE. On January 22nd, LEAs received their final eligibility determination from OSSE in QuickBase, and the MSAA test window will take place between March 19th and May 4th. All right, so additionally, alternate assessments being offered this year will be the alternate access for ELLs. Participation criteria are as follows.
So in the interest of time, so we can end by 11, right now we're going to move forward to showing you what that new participation form looks like in SEDS, and then we will finish up the webinar with a few announcements. But these slides about the alternate access for English learners are here for your reference, and if you have questions about the access the alternate access test or the DC Science alternate test, which is a portfolio, please reach out to Michael Craig, michael.craig@dc.gov. And now we're going to go into the SED staging site and give you a sneak peek just for 1 minute about what it's going to look like, that new form on October 23rd. And again, this form will be available on October 23rd. Until then, if you are finalizing a student's eligibility status for the alternate, you just rely on that PDF worksheet that you download, fill out, and upload back into SEDS. And our webinar today, we're just finishing up talking about training opportunities. So the related service provider training, again, please have all your related service providers sign up for this if they are not 100% comfortable, especially if they are new, And this is for both non-publics and public charter. It's for all related service providers because how they log services and SEDS does look the same for all of them. You yourself are invited to participate if you'd like to see SEDS through the eyes of your service providers. Also, we have this opportunity for the master teacher cadre for secondary special education. This is the third year we're offering this program. This is a long-term commitment of several months during the school year. However, teachers who participate in this, they will receive a stipend as well as professional learning units. This program begins in December and goes all the way through the spring. So we definitely encourage you to pass this information on to your participants. They can access the online application here. This is for secondary teachers who have students with disabilities in their classroom. And it is a lot of Saturday commitments. It's about once a month, a full day Saturday. You can see here the schedule. They will receive a stipend of $2,000 for their time, and they are eligible for up to 30 OSSE professional learning units. And this is by application only. And so you apply, and then you will be selected based on your experience. We're looking for experienced teachers of students with disabilities at the secondary level who are interested in becoming themselves a master teacher that can provide professional development to their own staff and colleagues and other educators in the city. That deadline for application is coming up next week. So if you can think of any outstanding teachers you have right now, they could be general ed or special ed teachers, as long as they have students with disabilities in their classroom, they will be eligible to apply for this program. And again, it's a $2,000 stipend, 30 PLU credits. We also have upcoming a webinar. Next, this year, similar to the LEA Special Ed POC monthly series, we also have a parallel series for English learner points of contact. Each month, English learner points of contact from LEAs and schools can join OSSE for a webinar on various topics. The topic for November just happens to be on English learners with significant cognitive disabilities. So there you have that dual identified population, and even more specifically, the population with a significant cognitive disability. So we're going to have a webinar. My colleague is giving this webinar. It should be really great. So please pass this on to any of your colleagues who might have this student population in their classroom. We also have a number of opportunities around restorative practices, which is a philosophy that really can create a positive culture and can help with a lot of behavior issues in the classroom. There's a monthly community of practice. There's an introductory webinar. There's in-person workshops. These I've just pulled out from the LEA Look Forward, some of the upcoming opportunities with registration links linked to the slides. So you can download the slides from the handouts to get those registration links, or you can read about it in the LEA Look Forward newsletter. We also will be having a Section 504 informational webinar coming up in a few weeks. If you are involved with Section 504 plans or identifying students because of their disability as being eligible for 504, if you're interested in learning more about that, we encourage you to join us for this webinar. It's a 2-hour webinar because we do go fairly deep with this, but here is the information for that. And student support teams trainings, we have some of those coming up, and other additional OSSE trainings. I'm going quickly through this because we are out of time, but you can use the slide deck to find out more about these trainings, or you can see them in the LEA Look Forward newsletter under the professional development section. So lots of good opportunities for your staff. You as the special ed point of contact, it is your job to pass on relevant information to your staff. So if you can think of any staff who may benefit from coming to some of these trainings, please share this information with them today so that they can register and plan ahead. Thank you so much for joining us today. We will stay on the line for just a couple minutes to continue taking questions, and you can see the contact information here for how to follow up with additional questions. Thank you, and we will look forward to seeing you next month at our webinar, which will be again on the 3rd Wednesday of the month. Thank you, and have a great week.